This video is not about Miranda's butt. I know gamers think that Miranda's butt is political, but Miranda's butt is not political. I'm going to be talking about real politics like security theater, semi-state actors, and communism, not fake politics like Miranda's butt. I know gamers are really concerned about the political implications of Miranda's butt, but this video is not about that. So I won't mention Miranda's butt again after this. Only real politics, real important politics, like Caden's butt. Everywhere I go, people say to me, Mackenzie Ayer, if that is your real name, and it's not, what is Mass Effect 2 about? What is this game that has been elevated into the gamer pantheon about? To them I say, well, it's a complicated question. If you go by the premise of the game, it's about protecting human colonies from the Collectors, but that doesn't really feel right, because you only visit 2 human colonies in the entire game, and it probably amounts to less than 2 hours of game time. So maybe we should consider instead what you actually spend most of your time doing. If you follow this logic, the game is mostly about Commander Shepard's vendetta against mercenaries, as you spend the majority of your time in a campaign of extermination against the Blue Sun's Blood Pack and Eclipse. Or maybe it's about what people remember the most about the game, in which case Mass Effect 2 is about seducing the most eligible heterosexual hotties in the galaxy, as gayness won't be invented until Mass Effect 3. All of these are acceptable interpretations of the game, but I feel that they're lacking. To me, Mass Effect isn't about events, but about places. From the barren rocks of Tuchanka to the rust buckets of the Quarian migrant fleet, Mass Effect 2 is about the places you go, about what those places say. As the second game in the series, it's mostly about fleshing out the world, or the galaxy of Mass Effect. World building, as some call it, as opposed to any strict plot structure. What I think is interesting about conceptualizing Mass Effect 2 in this way is how it imbues the game with the politics of spaces, of places. These places and people are political, but maybe not in the way you are assuming. Okay, so gamers have a real stick up their butt about politics in video games. Gamers, I love you. You know I love you. It's a mutual love here, but you need to calm down about the politics thing. Politics isn't something you can just divorce from art, and I will die on the hill that games are art, even if some games are like art with a lowercase a. I'm looking at you, Ubisoft. I think it comes down to what people think politics is. Depending on who you ask, politics is either whoever is running the government at the time and the strict rules and structures they may or may not follow, or it'll mean the gays. Neither is strictly wrong, but they're both limited. What politics is, when you boil it down, is power. Who has it, who wants it, and what they do with it. Governmental politics is a structured form of power, creating rules and regulations and processes, but it's only one form. Protesting is also politics, community organizing, religious services, riots, all these things that allocate power or are fighting over power. Who has it, and what is done with it, are political in nature. Now, you may think that this definition is overly broad, and I can understand why, but I think it's the only definition that fully encapsulates the word. Politics can take many forms, but it's all about who has power and who does not. So adding the gays, or people of color, to media is a certain type of politics. It's giving representation to a marginalized group, which could be seen as social capital, even if it's not intended to be a political statement. Often writers are simply using the common political hegemony, reproducing what exists, or what the cultural conception of politics is. In Mass Effect, for example, we have the Council. While the Council does not match any particular political ideology, what they do instead is reproduce the feeling of bureaucracy. They aren't meant to satire any particular system, but instead are designed in a way that we intrinsically understand as a bureaucratic system. They reproduce this idea of bureaucracy, but also the idea of bureaucracy being an obstacle to overcome. The council by and large gets in the way in all three games, and it's often our goal to go around them to do what needs to be done, which by itself is another trope that's just dripping with politics. But here we can see that this idea of a bureaucracy, what we understand to be bureaucracy, and that we understand bureaucracies often get in the way of what we feel needs to get done, are all inherently political and are reproduced in the council. Whether or not this was intentional is immaterial, because either way we can see the political meaning in the council as a reflection of not just our reality, but of our popular conceptions of reality, and of the conceptions of reality that the game designers and writers had. But there's also a concept in art called negative space. It is the area around the subject or subjects of a painting. The most famous example of this is this optical illusion, which is either a vase or two faces looking at each other, depending on the focus. Either the vase or the faces exist in this negative space. When used in a visual medium, negative space is very useful for showing scale, emphasizing feelings of being overwhelmed or lost or isolated. Positive space is the subject, and negative space is everything around the subject. But I think we can apply this to a story's world and the things that happen in that world. Large, expansive RPGs almost always have a created world, a fictional place with defined rules and relations that exist within that fictional place. You can look at what the world tells you to understand it, but you can also take a look at what it takes for granted. This can both be intentional and unintentional. Game of Thrones, for example, has no conception of democracy. It doesn't really come up even as a possibility. Okay, so in the books there is Volantis, but just ignore that for now. It's never seriously considered in the Seven Kingdoms.
We represent all the great houses, but whomever we choose, they won't just rule over lords and ladies. Maybe the decision about what's best for everyone should be left to, well, everyone.
The absence of this form of government is a negative space. It speaks to the nature and the culture of the world of Game of Thrones by its absence, and this was an intentional choice by George R. R. Martin to get across the feeling of this world. To look at an unintentional example, let's talk about the Outer Worlds, which is about hypercapitalism in space. However, as my other video on the game says, remember to like, comment, and subscribe, watch that video, it never presents an alternative to this capitalist system. Sure, some people oppose it, but it's never presented as an actual ideology. You'd almost think they hired the Ghostbusters to get rid of that specter haunting Europe. I'm funny, we do jokes here. But this lack of ideological opponent isn't just a weird choice. It says something about the people who created it, and the fact that it was created by a large corporation. Now, not every instance of a story or a world lacking something can be used to tell you more about that thing on a political level. Like, the fact that Mass Effect doesn't feature a Dance Dance Revolution minigame ending with a dance-off with Saren doesn't mean anything, except that the developers really dropped the ball.
Are your destiny. Leave the dead where they fall, assuming direct control. Are your destiny.
Negative space can best be seen when it's something close to the subject. So when looking at the Outer Worlds' biting critiques of capitalism, it's a lot more noticeable that they don't even bring up a proper alternative than it would be if, say, Pokemon doesn't mention an alternative to capitalism.
Who's that Pokemon?
So don't get me wrong, world building is a very difficult endeavor. When creating a fictional world, especially one for a video game with branching paths and choices, you have to walk a fine line between making it unique while also making it something the players can understand. It needs to be both familiar and novel. Given it's the second game in the series, you also have to have it be in-depth enough that fans of Mass Effect 1 feel like they're rewarded for playing the Mako Mountain Climber Simulator, but also give new players enough information to understand what's going on without front-loading exposition. So allow me to front-load some exposition. The Mass Effect galaxy is roughly divided into 3 sectors. Citadel space, which encompasses all of the colonies and core worlds of the Citadel species. The Attican Traverse, a relatively unsettled sector of space that was experiencing a boom of colonization in Mass Effect 1, mostly from humans. And the Terminus Systems, which is a lawless section of space and full of pirates and gangs and just general bad vibes.
At least it's not hard to find criminals here. All I have to do is point my gun and shoot.
Now, there's also Batarian space and their colonies somewhere around here, it's not really clear. And there's the Perseus Vale where the Geth reside, but they're like subsectors and don't count by themselves. The way Mass Effect makes this relatable is to create a divide between Citadel space and everywhere else, to act like the divide between the global north and the global south in popular conceptions. Or rather, it creates a very exaggerated version of this reality. Outside the stability of Citadel space, you either have criminal-run enterprises, small colonies constantly on the verge of being pirated, or Batarian totalitarianism. But the illusions are all there, and enough to get a general sense of what the world is and how to interact with it. As with the Council example before, the galaxy of Mass Effect is set out to be just alien enough, but with a framework we can readily understand. So when I say Council space represents the global north, I don't mean that it's full of white people, I mean that it's constructed to be understood as safe, to be capitalistic, to be stable. Now there's issues in this space to be sure, security and bureaucracy, but ultimately, Citadel space is good. It's stable. It makes things work. We understand the Citadel and the space around it to be the place with the power, both military and economic, and we see it as mostly benign, only really causing a problem that they ignore major crises until it's too late, which at least is, realistic. And this is represented not just in how the world is constructed, but in the very geography of these places. Mass Effect 2 really draws this comparison between the station of Omega and the station of the Citadel, with the Omega being described as the dark reflection of the Citadel in terminus space. And the physical layouts of this place really show you what the developers are trying to get you to think when you saw these stations. At the very center of the Citadel is the Citadel Tower, where the Council works. From there, the entire station, the ring of the Presidium, and the arms of the wards revolve around them. The reaching arms of the Citadel spread out in all directions like a hand grasping for the galaxy, and it tells us the galaxy too revolves around this place, this tower, these people. Omega, in contrast, is dark. Above the winding streets and inverted skyscrapers of Omega, there is no sky. Above, there is only a ceiling of stone and rock, and below, a drop of kilometers, and then the blackness of space. Omega is a cage. The inverted skyscrapers grasping into the black bars. These places are physical metaphors for our understanding of what these places represent. One of order and one of chaos. And I'm going to make it even more clear. I'm going to throw off the pretext and tell you what I really think. Give you some raw, uncensored, hardcore media analysis. While the Citadel space is more or less broadly based on the idea of the global north of the West, the Citadel as a place is blatantly the United States, particularly New York City. The Citadel Council, as I argued in my first Mass Effect video, is based partially off the United Nations, which is headquartered in New York City. Both places are incredibly multicultural, and both of these places were hit with a devastating terrorist attack that saw an increase in the security state. Wait, don't leave, just hear me out. So, for example, at the Citadel, you see an increase in security measures from Mass Effect 1. When you arrive, you go through this obnoxious scanner, and if the game had any balls at all, they'd make you wait in line for 45 minutes first. And then there's guards basically everywhere. There's a side quest that you can do that has you deal with a couple of Asari who have been flagged as possible Geth infiltrators, and are put on a no-fly list, a clear parody of Americans' no-fly list that often ends up putting children on the list, because these lists have essentially zero accountability, or zero recourse. Just so many children. How does this keep happening? This is an example of what is known as security theater, which is, as the name says, the appearance of security measures without any actual teeth to them. A performance art designed to make the viewer feel more safe without actually increasing safety. The term was popularized by Bruce Schneier in his book Beyond Fear, in which he discusses security measures and approaches. For an example of security theater that he gives in the real world is that immediately after 9/11, when everybody was justifiably scared to fly again, the government placed National Guard soldiers at airports around the country as a security measure, but never actually gave those soldiers bullets. In truth, the troops weren't there to fight terrorists, but instead they were there to fight fear. People were scared, and having soldiers with guns assuaged that fear in the short term, which helped the economic interests of the United States. Of course, these pieces of security theater did not end there. The TSA created more and more policies to stop terrorism. Scanners and patterns and scanners, more and more. And not just in airports, in government buildings, in schools, these things increased. These policies didn't stop terrorist attacks, not by and large. What they did was give the appearance of safety. Now, to be clear, some analysts don't always think this is a negative, depending on your point of view. Security theater, even if ineffective, might scare off some people attempting attacks, and providing a show of security might convince people who are nervous to spend money on flights again to go and fly, if that's the sort of thing you care about, and some people it was. Nevertheless, it's a question of value for money, and if the sacrifices in freedom are worth the cost. The parallel in Mass Effect 2 is obvious, both to show what the authors see as a possible reaction to the actions of Mass Effect 1, and then to critique it, and to create a societal pressure the player understands. This inherently political understanding of the physical space of the Citadel, divided by guards and checkpoints and scanners, to remind us of the physical spaces we all started to experience more and more after 9/11, in airports and government buildings, of spaces divided by security. But the critique isn't just that these systems exist, but that they exist as a direct response to a culturally traumatic event, and that this caused a rapid increase in security. The current neoliberal security state in the global north hasn't always existed. It was brought upon by a reaction to an event, or alternatively, by security apparatuses using the event to push for increased security. Mass Effect 2 plays into this by providing a direct contrast in how you view CSEC, the cops of the Citadel, and as we all know, all cops are bad. In Mass Effect 1, besides Garrus, the only CSEC officer you have any real interaction with is Executive Palin, the head of the organization, who was very, very strict about rules and regulations.
I've been with CSEC for 30 years. I've never had to break the law to do my job, not once. There are over 200,000 CSEC agents. Some of them are going to be bad. But we don't turn a blind eye to corruption like the Spectres do. We do our best to find and punish any officer who breaks the law.
But the CSEC you meet in Mass Effect 2 has fallen far from these ideals. When you first enter the Citadel in Mass Effect 2 and talk to Captain Bailey, one of the first things you hear him doing is him telling his subordinate to rough up a subject, which if you press him on, he'll vigorously defend as doing what needs to be done because he's the thin blue line between order and chaos. Blah, blah, blah.
I overheard your conversation. Make him scream a little?
This isn't a Presidium. All they have to worry about are protesters outside their free speech zones or someone's poodle crapping on the grass. Down here, we have drugs, organized crime, and murder. Policing a ward is like policing New York City. Sometimes you have to work outside the Council's rulebook. CSEC has changed.
Okay, but this contrast is not coincidental. It is the intent. Talking to people around the Citadel reveals that the attack caused mass casualties within CSEC, and those casualties were mostly filled up by power-hungry humans with their usual tactics, and that a lot of these new security postures were driven by humans. This is clearly intended to be a deliberate reference to increased security measures and the ideology that followed after 9/11. This is about as unsubtle as it gets, and it can get pretty unsubtle. But this is all overt political messaging. It's shining a light on contemporary politics, recreating the bureaucracies of the security state, and showing the problems that exist in the global north in reality, more or less, to make the Citadel feel more real. It's using politics as a shorthand for culture. We understand the Citadel because we understand these problems, as most people in the global north do, to one degree or another. But there's more going on here, because there's also the negative space, the blank spot where unchallenged assumptions go. In one memorable mission, you torture a local criminal with the help of the local corrupt cop Bailey, who, I must note, the game treats incredibly positively, despite him advocating for torture and having side bargains with criminals that he will ignore their activities, and you can barely challenge him on this shit. Now, you don't actually have to torture the criminal you bring in, but the game gives the option to you, and if you take that option, it works. This does not work in real life. Torture is incredibly inefficient in terms of getting actionable information. There have been studies from the American torture camp in Guantanamo Bay, and it just doesn't work. But here it's used, and it's one of the quickest ways to get the information you are looking for. The only thing that actually works faster is if you have a high renegade score and threaten to shoot him in the fucking head. Now, while believably renegade, the lack of consequences in how well it works is concerning because it implies what the game feels about these things, which is a little bit weird because earlier in the game explicitly critiques torture. Of course, a renegade shepherd can approve of that too, which is something else to consider. As an RPG, you are given choices in the game, but your choices are limited to mostly Paragon or Renegade. Now, all video games that give you choice are going to limit it in some way, usually not as explicit as the Mass Effect series does. This in many ways stifles your ability to look at the world that's been created. Now obviously there's going to be limits, and I'm not trying to critique the fact that there has to be a limit somewhere when creating these games, merely an observation that the usage of that system inevitably narrows the limits of possible reactions to the problem shown. For example, as someone very much against torture, there's no real option to call Bailey out on his bullshit or get him fired or anything. My option is limited, and so it's easy to fall into the trap of assuming the choices given are the only reasonable choices, that they are the limits to my possible understanding of this situation. Let's take another example. Purgatory, the prison ship where you find Jack, is clearly the Mass Effect take on the prison industrial complex. The ship is both enticing governments to send them prisoners and enticing them to allow them to hold prisoners indefinitely for a profit. And profit is a clear motivation, as the plot of this particular section makes clear. Though why he lets you keep your guns when he was trying to sell you into slavery, I haven't quite figured out. Genius, just fucking video games. Of course, as a renegade shepherd, you can approve of some of his horrible measures, just not his motives. And even as a paragon shepherd, you can only go so far as to question his methods. The people in the prison are insane and too dangerous, and that this assumption that insanity equals danger equals imprisonment is not questioned at all. You cannot question that. The game reinforces that even as a paragon, a requirement for supermax facilities exist, and only lets you question so much as you can suggest maybe nicer accommodations. Maybe give them a pool, still keep them interred forever because they're too crazy, but I don't know, give them a nice hot meal instead. After this mission, you get an email from an inmate. I don't know how he found your email address, apparently it's just public. And he tells you about how crazy he is, and how he's going to go killing again.
Oh boy, here I go killing again.
This is an example of negative space, an assumption made by the developers about the nature of the carceral system that found its way into the game. It reeks of assumptions based less on fact but on pop culture mythology. It's very easy to gloss over, interesting only as much as the option to oppose it does not exist. This is political. These assumptions about who should be imprisoned, about mental health links to violence, go unchallenged even by a paragon shepherd because it's simply assumed to be true by the world building itself. And there's a lot of examples of this where media informs media without an actual look into how these things might really work. Omega is possibly one of the biggest examples of this, and well, all of the Terminus systems where you spend most of your time in the game. This entire section of space is considered lawless, but paradoxically a threat. It is believed that if all the various rogue planets and systems joined forces, that they would pose a possible threat to Citadel space. This logic is why in the first game the Citadel won't send a fleet to Ilos to stop Saren, out of this fear. Somehow the region is completely lawless while also having enough military power that could possibly put up a fight, if not win. This is incredibly revealing about what the game designers assume about lawlessness, or assume about what exists outside of stability. What's very interesting to me is about how little the gangs that essentially dominate the Terminus systems spend trying to justify their own existence. We have the guns, they say, so we're in control, as if that would be a satisfactory answer, as if simply applying Max Weber's idea of a state sans legitimacy would keep them in control. But this isn't how it works. In reality, gangs and sub-state actors and rebel groups like this spend a lot of time justifying why they exist, whether it's because of grievances that have been thrust upon them or religious reasons. They always spend propaganda justifying justifying their existence as necessary, as required. So these gangs, the Blood Pack, the Eclipse, and the Blue Suns, are portrayed in multiple ways, sometimes as mercenaries for hire, sometimes as warlords, sometimes as petty gangs. They represent all these things in truth. What they represent in the world of Mass Effect 2 is a lack of order. But when we dig deeper, we find out this doesn't really work. In reality, when gangs or other semi-state actors take over an area, they intrinsically justify themselves. In Sean T. Flanagan's Motivations and Implications of Community Service Provisions by La Familia, Cucana, Knights Templar, and other Mexican drug cartels, he talks about the way Mexican drug cartels use community service to justify their control. He shows that based on his data, the more a gang or cartel creates a sense that they're justified, that they're giving the community something in return, the more the community will support them, and that the converse is also true. The more they rely on pure violence, the more violence is given to them in return by the community. Now, this latter part is explored to some degree of Archangel. Garrus, aka BioWare, let me date him. God damn it, why won't you let me date anybody I want to? In that, he performs the vigilante actions that Flanagan suggests is a common outcropping when gangs don't fully attend to the needs of community. But it still feels shallow. Like, okay, Garrus fought back, but why doesn't anyone else? Omega is a cesspit and has been for decades. It seems like every place on Omega is the same, and never once do we hear of the common folk fighting back against these oppressive systems that notably don't even try to hide their oppression. It's not like the gangs justify their power as the will of God or the will of the market, and how often are those things synonymous? They're just like, well, we have the guns and you don't. This is insufficient. Oh yeah, the self-proclaimed Queen of Omega.
I'm the boss, CEO, queen if you're feeling dramatic. It doesn't matter. Omega has no titled ruler and only one rule. Don't fuck with Arya.
Doesn't even lift a finger when an Asari sex vampire murderess starts killing people. And no, I'm not going to be discussing the Asari sex vampire murderesses because there's a lot to unpack here, and I don't have the time to unpack the Asari. I'm sorry, it's fucked. But the point remains, this ruler doesn't even appear to help her people. If someone opposes her, she'll kill them, but never attempt to justify herself or institutionalize her power. Like, picture a military rebel group in your mind. Say an incredibly violent one. Just close your eyes and imagine one. Okay, so you're thinking about ISIS, right? Don't fucking pretend you aren't, I know you are. So, throughout the early years of ISIS, starting in or around 2007 through 2011, ISIS would be hard-pressed to be called a state. They had very few features of a state, barring some limited taxation, basically operating as a criminal gang. However, as time went on and they controlled more and more territory, they increased the controls by institutionalizing key parts of their territory. Specifically, they started creating ministries of health and oil, but slowly ramping up control with other various administrations. You know, they had laws, taxes, fees, fines, and even garbage collection over time. Although not considered a true state by any international law, they had started to create the appearance of a state, and not just for appearances, but because at a certain point, to maintain control, you need to have certain functions or things fall apart. If you're not really controlling things, people will realize you don't have that control. Meanwhile, it doesn't seem like Omega or its 8 million inhabitants have any institutionalized structure at all, nor even any attempt at one. There's only violence inflicted on them. Damn it, somebody has to sweep the floors. And I don't need it to be super detailed, but when you go to a place like the Citadel, you can see an attempt at an institutionalized structure. But it's clear when you go to Omega and the way Arya presents itself that this structure does not exist. It's not that it's not shown, but it's very clear it doesn't exist. What this speaks to is a particular cultural attitude, the idea that there's the West and the rest, that places outside of the usual liberal hegemonic order are inherently flawed and corrupt without anything resembling stability, and that this is prevalent throughout the Terminus systems. It almost feels like Orientalism, where we have Citadel space, which is coded very deliberately to remind us of the global north, a mirror to reflect our own culture and problems, if somewhat distorted, than the rest of the galaxy. And everywhere else in the Mass Effect world is much worse than Citadel space. You have these human colonies on the fringes edges of acceptable space, which are often preyed upon by pirates, enslavers, and, collectors. You have the chaos and gang control of the terminus systems with nary a functioning planet existing. Or you have the Praetorian hegemony, which is coded to remind us of a sudden rogue state, complete with crumbling prison camps. The crumbling prison camp, by the way, is the only Praetorian world you go to in all 3 games. Throughout the games, every example of society that exists outside the confines of the Citadel is precarious or oppressive. Life outside the Citadel is nasty, brutish, and short. And if we take the Citadel to be a reflection of the Western world, what do we take everything else? Where are the other examples? Now, to a certain extent, this can be excused. This is an action RPG shooter after all, and you're playing a soldier, not a diplomat. Obviously, most of the places you're going to are going to need to be shot at. That's the core mechanic of this game, shooting. Or if you're me, charging at the enemy and dying because I put myself in a bad position for like the goddamn 50th time, I'm actually really bad at this game. But I don't think this is a satisfactory answer. No, I think that by creating the galaxy in this way, the designers were relying on shorthand. They wanted you to explore the dangerous far edges of space. They wanted you to feel like a badass, and relied on this type of shorthand. It's easier to say, as a ruthless gang leader, than examine in any meaningful way the type of organizational structure you'd need to operate a station of that size. We all intrinsically understand what gangs and rebels do. Well, at least we think we do. But the reality is more complicated. What this does is reproduce a certain type of political understanding that is actually divorced from reality. In one way, you can look at the galaxy of Mass Effect 2 as a type of propaganda. Now, I don't necessarily think it was intended this way, but that is the result. It reproduces certain cultural attitudes and understanding, and while the game attempts to grapple with complex issues, especially in regards to things like the Quarians and the Geth War and the Krogan genophage, when the game moves away from intentional political discussion, then it becomes all the more revealing about what the games are about and what Mass Effect 2 and the places are saying. There are things that the game lets you challenge. There are preconceived notions that exist within the world of Mass Effect that you have the option to deny. You get to decide if the Quarians and Geth were correct. You get to decide if the Krogan deserve their fate. There are political implications here, but what's more interesting to me is what the game takes for granted. You can question if Purgatory is successfully run or effective, but you cannot question if prisons should exist at all. You cannot question these assumptions about mental illness, about how we should handle crime. You can question Bailey's methods, but you can't stop him or really challenge him in a meaningful way. You can just choose to participate or not, a seemingly benign option. You cannot question this assumption that the game makes, that everything outside the Citadel control is nasty, brutish, and short. Now, you might say, there are examples of functioning societies outside of Citadel control. You have Tuchanka, which is barely functioning and doesn't really get anywhere until like Mass Effect 3, and even then I think they still fall under the Citadel, so it doesn't count. There's also this planet that I found in the codex that I run by the Elcor, and it doesn't really go into detail. This is all I found. And then of course there's Ilium, which is a planet on the fringes between Terminus space and Citadel space. But even while Ilium is nominally a non-Citadel aligned planet, it's controlled by people from the Citadel. Specifically, it's run by corporations. And it's made very clear throughout the game that Ilium may look nicer, but it's still just as harsh as the rest of the Terminus systems, just painted over. And while it's not necessarily unrealistic for corporations from the global north to go down to the global south and oppress the workers while trying to hide that fact from the global north, it's still not a positive outlook of Ilium as a whole. If we look at the game this way, it makes one thing clear, that in the galaxy of Mass Effect, there is no alternative. Citadel space is broadly based on Western culture, on our ideas of the military and of multiculturalism, and it presents everything else as backwards. It ignores any of the possibilities for societies to exist outside of the strict control of these supranational authorities and militaries. We see in places outside of the Citadel assumptions about how they must be like, how bad it must be. That's really it. This is not reproducing reality, but reproducing a cultural conception that we in the global north have about what it must be like to live in so-called third world countries. It removes the nuance to make it easily digestible and understandable to a presumed Western audience. But in reproducing this mode of understanding, it reinforces this idea that there is no alternative. Look, I'm not saying that Mass Effect 2 is a bad game. It's great. I really enjoy it. My goal here wasn't to make you feel bad for liking a thing, but instead to pick apart the ways our cultural conceptions of reality can be flawed, and how the media we consume reproduces these cultural conceptions. That this, too, has a distinctly political agenda. That this too is political, even if we don't think about it, even if it exists within our assumptions, within this negative space. Okay, that's the video. I hope you liked it. I rewrote the script like 5 times once again because I wasn't happy with it. If you have any issues with anything I mentioned here, if you disagree with me, you just tell me in the comments and I'll just completely ignore you because I'm objectively correct. Art, as we all know, can be objectively understood, and as I am an objective, rational person, I have objectively understood Mass Effect 2, and there's no other possible interpretations, because I am objective and rational. So, you must be wrong. That's how objectivity works, that's how art works. See you next time.
It's pure ideology.